The 4 o'clock whistle of the Edgar Thompson Steelworks on the south bank of the Monongahela River in Braddock, Pennsylvania, 8 miles upriver from the point in downtown Pittsburgh, sounded at exactly 4:04 on a humid Tuesday afternoon in mid-July, the way it had sounded on every weekday afternoon at exactly 4:04 since November of 1875, the day Andrew Carnegie's first blast furnace had gone into production. The way every careful steel and bricklaying tradesman within the small, careful 11-square-mile circle of the Monongahela Valley had, for 150 years, learned to set down the small, careful Tuesday afternoon trowel and the small, careful Tuesday afternoon brick at the small, careful 4 o'clock whistle and to wipe the small, careful Tuesday afternoon mortar from the small, careful Tuesday afternoon palms. On the small, careful brick scaffold of the third course of the small, careful 9-story limestone and brick Liberty Riverwalk, mixed-use development at the corner of Smallman Street and 26th Street in the Strip District at the north bank of the Allegheny River in downtown Pittsburgh, 4 miles upriver from the point. 8 courses below the small, careful 9-story finished height, the Vandermeer Development Group's small, careful 2024 building permit had specified, the small, careful Tuesday afternoon trowel of the small, careful Tuesday afternoon journeyman bricklayer at the small, careful third course, set down at exactly 4:04, on the small, careful evidence of the 4 o'clock whistle drifting 8 miles upriver on the careful Pittsburgh humid afternoon air. The trowel was, on the small, careful evidence of one careful Pittsburgh bricklayer's trade tradition, the small, careful Tilcher Tools 14-inch wood-handled brick trowel that had belonged to the journeyman bricklayer's late husband. The brick was a small, careful red Glenshaw clay paver. The journeyman bricklayer was, on the small, careful third course of the Liberty Riverwalk's east-facing limestone and brick exterior elevation, a 32-year-old African-American woman in a soft, careful navy duck-cloth Carhartt jumpsuit, with a small, careful cream thread embroidered Bridgewater over her left chest pocket, scuffed brown leather steel-toed work boots with red Pittsburgh brick dust on the toes, a small, careful soft-folded yellow leather bricklayer's belt at her hip, with a small, careful brass mason's level, and a small, careful canvas pouch of small, careful brick wedges, a small, careful red bandana tied at the back of her head, and her small, careful, steady, weather-tanned Pittsburgh bricklayer's hands flat on the small, careful third course of the small, careful east-facing limestone and brick wall. Her name was Mrs. Ophelia Bridgewater. She was, on the small, careful afternoon of the second Tuesday of July, in fact, 32 years old, the widow of the late Mr. Orrin Bridgewater, the third-generation Pittsburgh bricklayer who had passed of complications from a steel mill industrial accident at the Edgar Thompson Steelworks on the small, careful Wednesday afternoon of the 17th of June 4 years and 1 month earlier, and the single mother of an 8-year-old daughter named Iris Bridgewater. She was a 32-year-old African-American woman, 5 feet and 7 inches tall, lean, weather-tanned bricklayer's frame from 4 years of laying brick 8 hours a day, 6 days a week, warm, medium brown skin, large, dark, almond-shaped eyes with the careful, steady watchfulness of a Pittsburgh widow, full lips, no makeup, a small, tarnished silver hoop in each ear, and a small, careful crescent-shaped scar on her right cheekbone from a falling small, careful brick chip on a small, careful job site in the spring of 2021. On her left ring finger, she wore the small, thin gold wedding band Mr. Orrin Bridgewater had, on the morning of the third Saturday of August 2015, slid onto her finger at the small, careful First African Methodist Episcopal Church on Elm Street in the Hill District. On her right ring finger, nothing. She had, in the 4 years and 1 month since the small, careful Edgar Thompson industrial accident, in fact, not in any honest accounting, taken the small, thin gold wedding band off. Mr. Orrin Bridgewater had, on the small, careful Wednesday afternoon of the 17th of June 4 years and 1 month earlier, in fact, on the careful evidence of one careful Edgar Thompson Steelworks small, careful industrial accident. In fact, on the small, careful private investigation of the small, careful Pennsylvania OSHA careful region. 3 Field Office. On the small, careful private accounting of the small, careful Edgar Thompson 2021. Small, careful furnace stack replacement project on which Krieger Masonry had, in fact, been the small, careful sub-bricklayer for the small, careful furnace lining face course, fallen from the small, careful third level of the small, careful furnace stack scaffold, 31 feet onto the small, careful Edgar Thompson basic oxygen shop concrete floor at exactly 2:04 on the small, careful Wednesday afternoon. He had been 31 years old. He had been the third generation of small, careful Bridgewater, Pittsburgh bricklayers since his careful grandfather, Mr. Walden. Bridgewater had, in 1946, opened the careful small Bridgewater masonry firm of Hill District, the small, careful Pennsylvania OSHA careful region. 3 Field Office had, on the morning of the 2nd of August 4 years and 1 month earlier, in fact, on the small, careful private investigation of 43 Edgar Thompson 2021 furnace stack scaffold safety incidents, in fact, found the small, careful 2021 furnace stack scaffold to have been, in fact, in any honest accounting, on the strength of one careful Wednesday afternoon investigation. In fact, on the small, careful evidence of one careful steel mill, careful basic oxygen shop, careful corner. In fact, the small, careful unsafe scaffold, sub-careful third-party assembled scaffold of one careful unrelated careful steel mill, scaffold subcontractor, not in fact on the small, careful private accounting of Krieger Masonry's careful brick face course. The small, careful Pennsylvania OSHA settlement had, on the small, careful private courtesy of one careful steel mill, in fact, paid Mrs. Ophelia Bridgewater the small, careful Pennsylvania State Workers' Compensation, careful $111,000 small, careful settlement on the morning of the 3rd of October 4 years and 1 month earlier. Mrs. Ophelia Bridgewater had, with great unhurried care on the small, careful private accounting of one careful Pittsburgh widow, in fact, banked the small, careful $111,000 settlement at Dollar Bank on Forbes Avenue and had, in the 4 years and 1 month since, in fact, in any honest accounting, kept the small, careful settlement. In fact, on the small, careful private accounting of one careful Mrs. Ophelia Bridgewater, in fact, on the strength of the small, careful 8-year-old Iris Bridgewater's careful college fund, in the careful Dollar Bank passbook account, untouched. Standing 4 scaffold bays north of Mrs. Ophelia Bridgewater on the small, careful third course of the same limestone and brick east-facing wall, in his soft, careful navy duckcloth Carhartt jumpsuit, with the small, careful cream thread embroidered Krieger over his left chest pocket and his small, careful soft-folded brown leather bricklayer's belt, and his small, careful, soft-folded, battered cream straw bricklayer's bandana tied at the back of his careful silver head, was Mr. Werner Krieger, 68 years old that July. The small, careful master mason of the small, careful Krieger masonry firm of Lawrenceville, Pennsylvania, who had been Mr. Orrin Bridgewater's careful master since 2003, and Mrs. Ophelia Bridgewater's careful master since the small, careful afternoon of the 11th of August 4 years and 1 month earlier, the small, careful Tuesday on which Mr. Werner Krieger had walked into the small, careful Bridgewater bungalow on Forbes Avenue in Polish Hill at 4:11 in the afternoon, sat down on the small, careful, soft front room sofa across from Mrs. Ophelia Bridgewater and her then 4-year-old daughter Iris, and had said in his soft, careful, low Pittsburgh voice, "Share the trade. I will share, on the strength of one careful master mason of 48 years tenure, in fact, on the strength of Orrin's careful Tilcher Tools 14-inch trowel, in fact, take you on, share, as my careful 11 o'clock apprentice. The Krieger Masonry. Careful 11 o'clock apprentice rate is $14.11 an hour. Walk to the small, careful job site at 6 on Monday morning. Bring share orange trowel. Mrs. Ophelia Bridgewater had, on the small, careful afternoon of the 11th of August, said only, "Mr. Krieger, Werner." Yes. She had walked to the small, careful job site at 6 on the Monday morning. She had brought orange trowel. She had been in the 4 years and 1 month since, in fact, on the careful private observation of one careful Mr. Werner Krieger. The small, careful, steady, a small, careful, third-course bricklayer Krieger masonry had employed in 48 years of careful Pittsburgh masonry tradition. Standing 6 scaffold bays north of Mrs. Ophelia Bridgewater and 2 scaffold bays north of Mr. Werner Krieger, in his small, careful, pale blue Oxford button-up shirt, with the careful, small, embroidered Liberty Riverwalk site supervisor over his left chest pocket, and his small, careful tan canvas khakis, and his small, careful, soft-cleaned white hard hat, was Mr. Roderick Sweeney, 51 years old that July, the careful Vandermeer Development Group's careful small site supervisor for the small, careful Liberty Riverwalk project, who had been Mr. Donovan Vandermeer's careful small site supervisor for 14 years on the strength of one careful original 2010 small careful Vandermeer Group hire, and on the strength of 14 years of small careful average careful site management performance. Mr. Roderick Sweeney did not, on the small, careful afternoon of the second Tuesday of July at 4:04, on the strength of the small, careful Edgar Thompson 4 o'clock whistle, in fact, set down his small, careful clipboard. Mr. Roderick Sweeney had, in fact, on the small, careful private accounting of his small, careful, unsteady, small, careful career, watched for the small, careful 11 months since Mrs. Ophelia Bridgewater had been transferred from the small, careful Krieger Masonry Lawrenceville crew to the small, careful Liberty Riverwalk job in mid-August of last year. In fact, the small, careful, steady, small, careful, patient, careful work of one careful Mrs. Ophelia Bridgewater on the small, careful third course of the east-facing wall, and had, on the small, careful private accounting of one careful site supervisor, whose own careful 2024 third quarter Vandermeer Group performance review was, in fact, on the small, careful evidence of the small, careful July site walkthrough schedule, scheduled for the small, careful Friday afternoon of the second Friday of August 3 weeks from now. In fact, on the small, careful private resentment of one careful Mr. Roderick Sweeney, decided that the small, careful evidence of one careful Mrs. Ophelia Bridgewater's careful, small, steady third-course brickwork would, in fact, in any honest account, in fact, on the small, careful evidence of one careful Vandermeer Group third-quarter performance review, in fact, on the small, careful private accounting of one careful Mr. Roderick Sweeney, in fact, become, in fact, the small, careful third-quarter accomplishment of the small, careful site supervisor, and not, in fact, of the small, careful third-course bricklayer. Mr. Roderick Sweeney had, in the small, careful 11 months that followed, in fact, with great unhurried care, on the small, careful evidence of 14 careful site walkthroughs, and on the strength of one careful Vandermeer Group, small, careful site supervisors, careful clipboard, in fact, with great unhurried care, in fact, on every Monday morning at 6:04, on every Wednesday morning at 6:04, on every Friday morning at 6:04, in fact, with great unhurried care, in fact, found a small, careful, unhurried, small, careful Tuesday afternoon or Friday afternoon, careful pretext to, in fact, on the small, careful evidence of one careful site supervisor's careful clipboard. Write up Mrs. Ophelia Bridgewater on a small, careful one-page Vandermeer Group careful Form 42, a small, careful disciplinary observation. The pretext had been in order. A small, careful, unsafe scaffold-based step on the morning of the second Monday of September. A small, careful, unsafe trowel handle grip on the afternoon of the third Wednesday of September. A small, careful, improper hard hat positioning on the morning of the first Friday of October. And 43 further small, careful Form 42. A careful pretext in the months that followed. Mr. Werner Krieger had, on the small, careful private observation of one careful master mason, watched the careful pretext begin on the small, careful afternoon of the second Monday of September. He had, on the strength of 48 careful Pittsburgh masonry years, in fact, on the small, careful private courtesy of one careful master mason, decided, on the careful evening of the third Wednesday of September, in fact, on the strength of one careful unsteady site supervisor, that the small, careful, steady, patient, quiet 11-month silence Mr. Werner Krieger would, in fact, in any honest accounting, in fact, with great unhurried care, would be, in fact, in his own small, careful private accounting of 48 careful Pittsburgh masonry years. In fact, the small, careful, unhurried, steady, careful, patient, careful, unhurriedness of one careful master mason who had, in fact, on the strength of 48 careful Pittsburgh masonry years, learned that one careful, unsteady site supervisor will, on the strength of 43 small, careful, Form 42, a pretext, in fact, in any honest accounting, in fact, on the small, careful evidence of one careful Tuesday afternoon 4 o'clock whistle. In fact, eventually, in fact, on the strength of one careful Vandermeer Group careful Tuesday afternoon site walkthrough. In fact, on the strength of one careful Vandermeer Group careful third quarter performance review. In fact, in any honest accounting. In fact, on the small, careful private accounting of one careful, unsteady site supervisor. In fact, the careful, unsteady site supervisor's own careful, Pittsburgh grave. Mr. Werner Krieger had, in the small, careful 11 months that followed, on the small, careful private accounting of one careful master mason of 48 years tenure. In fact, watch the small, careful Form 42A pretext pile up in the small, careful Krieger Masonry careful Lawrenceville office filing cabinet at the small, careful corner of his careful walnut writing desk in the careful first floor office, and had, on the small, careful private accounting of one careful Pittsburgh master mason, in fact, on the small, careful private accounting of one careful man who had, in 48 years of careful Pittsburgh masonry, learned the small, careful private signs of one careful, unsteady, small, careful site, supervisor's careful clipboard, written on the small, careful private back of his own small, careful navy duck cloth, Carhartt jumpsuit. The small, careful private observation that Mr. Roderick Sweeney was, in fact, on the small, careful, steady, small, careful, patient, careful evidence of 43 Form 42. A pretext, in fact, in any honest accounting, building on the small, careful Vandermeer Group careful third quarter performance review schedule. The small, careful, pretextual file that would, on the careful Friday afternoon of the second Friday of August, 3 weeks from now, in fact, on the small, careful evidence of 43 Form 42A pretext, in fact, allow Mr. Roderick Sweeney to, in fact, recommend the careful termination of one careful Mrs. Ophelia Bridgewater's careful Krieger Masonry subcontractor placement on the small, careful Liberty Riverwalk Vandermeer Group careful project. Mr. Werner Krieger had not, in the small, careful 11 months that followed, in fact, on the small, careful private accounting of one careful master mason, told Mrs. Ophelia Bridgewater. Mr. Werner Krieger had, instead, on the small, careful private accounting of one careful man who had, since the morning of the 11th of August, 4 years and 1 month earlier, in fact, on the small, careful evidence of one careful trowel and one careful Polish Hill front room sofa, in fact, taken on Mrs. Ophelia Bridgewater as the small, careful 11 o'clock apprentice he would, in any honest accounting, in fact, on the careful Sunday afternoon of his own quiet retirement at the careful age of 73, in fact, on the small, careful private accounting of 48 years of careful Pittsburgh masonry, in fact, decided would be, in fact, the careful master mason of the small, careful Krieger masonry firm of Lawrenceville, Pennsylvania, after his own quiet retirement, simply on the small, careful private accounting of one careful man's careful private resolve, in fact, on the small, careful private morning of the second Tuesday of July. In fact, in fact, with great unhurried care, on the small, careful evidence of the small, careful Edgar Thompson 4 o'clock whistle, set down his own small, careful tilt your tools, 16-inch wood-handled brick trowel, taken off his small, careful, soft-folded, battered, cream straw bricklayer's bandana, walked the 11 steps from his own scaffold bay across the small, careful third-course scaffold to where Mrs. Ophelia Bridgewater was, in fact, on the small, careful 4 o'clock whistle, wiping the small, careful Tuesday afternoon mortar from her small, careful Tuesday afternoon palms, and had said in his small, careful, low Pittsburgh voice, "Share. The Lord, in my private opinion, has, on this small, careful Tuesday afternoon at the small, careful evidence of the 4 o'clock whistle, in fact, set up, in fact, on the small, careful Vandermeer Group careful site walkthrough schedule. In fact, on this Tuesday afternoon at 4:09, in fact, on the strength of one careful Mr. Donovan Vandermeer's careful Tuesday afternoon walkthrough, in fact, on the small, careful private accounting of one careful master mason of 48 years' tenure. The small, careful Tuesday afternoon walkthrough at which one careful master mason will, in fact, on the strength of 4 to 8 careful Pittsburgh masonry years. In fact, in fact, with great unhurried care, in fact, walk Mr. Donovan Vandermeer down the careful third course of the east-facing wall. And in fact, in any honest accounting, in fact, point, in fact, with great unhurried care at the small, careful third course you have, share in 11 months laid. Mrs. Ophelia Bridgewater said, in her small, careful, low Pittsburgh voice, "Mr. Krieger, Werner, yes?" Mr. Donovan Vandermeer had, on the small, careful afternoon of the second Tuesday of July at exactly 4:07, on the small, careful Vandermeer Group. Careful Tuesday afternoon. Site walkthrough schedule. He had been keeping at the small, careful printed, careful schedule on the corner of his careful walnut partner's desk, on the 33rd floor of the careful Vandermeer Development Group Tower at 1 Smithfield Street in downtown Pittsburgh, since the careful founding of Vandermeer Development Group in 2010. In fact, on the small, careful evidence of one careful site walkthrough schedule. In fact, walked across the small, careful Liberty River Walk, careful construction site mud and gravel parking lot on the careful corner of Smallman Street and 26th Street, in the Strip District at the careful, small Pittsburgh humid afternoon of the second Tuesday of July, in his soft, careful Vandermeer Group careful site visit clothes, a soft, careful pale blue Oxford button-up shirt with the small, careful cream thread embroidered V over his left chest pocket, dark wash slim work jeans, polished cordovan steel-toed work boots, a small, careful soft cleaned white hard hat with a small, careful cream Vandermeer fee on the front, and a small, careful soft brown leather portfolio under his right arm. Mr. Donovan Vandermeer was, on the small, careful afternoon of the second Tuesday of July, in fact, 39 years old. He was a tall, broad-shouldered African-American man with deep, warm brown skin, short, neatly groomed black hair, clipped in a sharp, low fade, a full, close-trimmed black beard threaded faintly with silver at the jawline, calm, careful, dark brown, observant eyes behind thin silver wire-frame reading glasses on a thin silver chain, most often folded into the small, careful breast pocket of his Oxford. A small, faint scar through his outer left eyebrow from a careful, small site visit, slip on a small, careful site in 2017, and the small, careful, unhurriedness of a 39-year-old founder and CEO of a small, careful Pittsburgh real estate development concern, Mr. Donovan Vandermeer had founded, on the strength of his late father's small, careful, Mr. Hampton Vandermeer's small, careful $3 million 2010 inheritance, and on the strength of his own small, careful. Pittsburgh real estate development in fact, on the small, careful private accounting of one careful July afternoon, into a small, careful $460 million Pittsburgh real estate development concern with 11 careful Pittsburgh and Allegheny Valley careful active projects. Mr. Donovan Vandermeer had, on the small, careful site walkthrough afternoon of the second Tuesday of July at 4:07. In fact, in his careful Vandermeer group, small, careful, unhurriedness, walked across the small, careful mud and gravel parking lot, accepted a small, careful, soft-cleaned white hard hat with a small, careful cream Vandermeer fee on the front from the small, careful site supervisor's careful trailer assistant, Ms. Imogene Pellegrino climbed the small, careful steel tube scaffold ladder of the small, careful east-facing wall and had, on the small, careful third course at 4:09 in the afternoon, met Mr. Werner Krieger and Mrs. Ophelia Bridgewater at the small, careful third course of the careful east-facing limestone and brick wall. Mr. Werner Krieger had, on Mr. Donovan Vandermeer's having stepped onto the small, careful third course scaffold bay, said in his small, careful, low Pittsburgh voice, "Mr. Vandermeer, Donovan, forgive the small, careful Tuesday afternoon interruption. I would, sir, with great unhurried care, on the strength of 48 careful Pittsburgh masonry years, like, sir, in fact, with the small, careful, soft-folded brown leather bricklayer's belt of one careful master mason, walk you, sir, the small, careful 11 scaffold bays of the careful third course of the careful east-facing wall, and, in fact, on the strength of 11 months of small, careful third course brickwork. Point at the small, careful third course you are, sir. On the careful Vandermeer Group small, careful Tuesday afternoon site walkthrough, in fact, looking at." Mr. Donovan Vandermeer had said, "Mr. Krieger, sir, walk me." Mr. Werner Krieger had walked him. They walked the 11 small, careful scaffold bays of the third course of the east-facing wall in 14 unhurried, careful minutes. Mr. Werner Krieger had, on every fourth small, careful scaffold bay, set his careful trowel tip on the small, careful third-course brick line and, with great unhurried care, said only, "Mr. Vandermeer, sir, the corner course. Look, sir, at the small, careful corner course." Mr. Donovan Vandermeer had, on every fourth small, careful scaffold bay, looked at the small, careful corner course. He had, by the seventh small, careful scaffold bay, in fact, on the small, careful evidence of one careful Vandermeer Group developer's careful private observation of one careful Pittsburgh masonry tradition, taken off his thin silver wire frame reading glasses, folded them carefully, tucked them into the small, careful breast pocket of his Oxford, and had, with great unhurried care, on the strength of his own small, careful Pittsburgh real estate development eye, said only, in his small, careful, low Pittsburgh voice, "Mr. Krieger, Werner, sir." The careful third course is, sir, in fact, on the small, careful private accounting of one careful Pittsburgh real estate developer of 14 years. In fact, in any honest accounting, the small, careful, steadiest, small, careful third course I have, sir, ever in 14 careful Vandermeer Group years, in fact, on a careful Tuesday afternoon site walkthrough, in fact, looked at. Whose, sir, is the small, careful third course? Mr. Werner Krieger had said, "Mr. Vandermeer, the small, careful third course is, sir, in fact, the small, careful third course of one careful Mrs. Ophelia Bridgewater of Polish Hill, the small, careful 11 o'clock apprentice I took on, sir, on the careful Tuesday afternoon of the 11th of August 4 years and 1 month earlier, on the strength of one careful Tilcher Tools 14-inch wood-handled brick trowel that had belonged, sir, to her late husband, Mr. Orrin Bridgewater, who had, sir, in fact, on the careful Wednesday afternoon of the 17th of June 4 years and 1 month earlier, in fact, on the careful Edgar Thompson Steel Works small, careful industrial accident, in fact, in any honest accounting, in fact, with great unhurried sorrow, in fact, passed. Mr. Donovan Vandermeer had not, for the length of perhaps 11 slow, careful held seconds, spoken. He had then said, very quietly, "Mr. Krieger, sir, Where, sir, is Mrs. Ophelia Bridgewater on this small, careful Tuesday afternoon at 4:11? Mr. Werner Krieger had said, Mr. Vandermeer, sir, on the small, careful third course, sir, 4 Scaffold Bays South. Mr. Donovan Vandermeer had walked the 4 Scaffold Bays South. Mr. Werner Krieger had walked with great unhurried care behind him. At the 4th Scaffold Bay South, on the small, careful third course of the east-facing wall, on the small, careful evidence of the 4 o'clock whistle still being on the small, careful Tuesday afternoon Pittsburgh bricklayers' trade tradition. In fact, the small, careful 11-minute small, careful Tuesday afternoon break, Mrs. Ophelia Bridgewater was, in fact, in her soft, careful navy duck-cloth Carhartt jumpsuit and her small, careful red bandana, and her small, careful soft-folded yellow leather bricklayer's belt, and her small, careful weather-tanned Pittsburgh bricklayer's hands flat on the small, careful third course, drinking a small, careful chipped blue ceramic mug of warm chicory coffee from a small, careful, soft-folded steel thermos Mr. Werner Krieger had on every Tuesday afternoon at exactly 4:04 for 11 months, in fact, on the small, careful, private courtesy of one careful master mason, brought up the small, careful steel tube scaffold ladder and laid on the small, careful third course brick line for her. Mr. Donovan Vandermeer had said in his small, careful, low Pittsburgh voice, Mrs. Bridgewater, ma'am, forgive the small, careful Tuesday afternoon 4 o'clock whistle interruption. My name, ma'am, is Mr. Donovan Vandermeer of Vandermeer Development Group. I have, ma'am, in fact, on the strength of one careful master mason's careful Tuesday afternoon, walked down the small, careful third course of the small, careful east-facing wall of the careful Liberty Riverwalk, in fact, on the small, careful private accounting of one careful Pittsburgh real estate developer of 14 years tenure, in fact, on the small, careful evidence of one careful third course, in fact, on the careful Tuesday afternoon at 4:14, in fact, looked at, ma'am, the small, careful, steadiest, small, careful third course brickwork I have, ma'am, in 14 careful Vandermeer Group years. In fact, on a careful Tuesday afternoon site walkthrough, in fact, looked at. Ma'am, the small, careful third course is, in fact, ma'am, in any honest accounting, ma'am, yours. Mrs. Ophelia Bridgewater had said in her small, careful, low Pittsburgh voice. Mr. Vandermeer? Donovan, sir. The small, careful third course is, sir, on the strength of 43 small, careful Tuesday afternoon and Wednesday afternoon, Form 42, a pretext on the small, careful site supervisor's clipboard of one careful Mr. Roderick Sweeney, in fact, on the small, careful evidence of the small, careful. Friday afternoon of the second Friday of August, 3 weeks from now, in fact, on the small, careful Vandermeer Group careful third quarter performance review, in fact, in any honest accounting, sir? In fact, mine. I will, sir, in fact, on the small, careful private accounting of one careful Pittsburgh widow of 4 years and 1 month, in fact, on the small, careful Friday afternoon of the second Friday of August, 3 weeks from now, in fact, on the small, careful evidence of 43 Form 42. A pretext, in fact, on the small, careful Vandermeer Group small, careful third quarter performance review, in fact, in any honest accounting, lose, sir, the small, careful third course. Mr. Donovan Vandermeer had not, on Mrs. Ophelia Bridgewater's careful, low Pittsburgh voice, on the strength of 43 Form 42. A pretext in the small, careful Friday afternoon of the second Friday of August, 3 weeks from now, in fact, on the small, careful private accounting of one careful Pittsburgh real estate developer of 14 years, for the length of perhaps 11 slow, careful held seconds, spoken. He had then said in his small, careful, low Pittsburgh voice, Mr. Krieger, sir, Mrs. Bridgewater, ma'am, will you, sir, ma'am, with great unhurriedness, on the strength of one careful Tuesday afternoon 4 o'clock whistle, in fact, accept, sir, ma'am, the small, careful, unhurried courtesy of meeting me, sir, ma'am, this Thursday afternoon at exactly 4:04, at the small, careful corner table of Defer Coffee and Tea on Smallman Street, 4 blocks south of the careful Liberty Riverwalk. In order to, sir, ma'am, in fact, with great unhurried care, in fact, in any honest accounting, in fact, on the strength of 43 Form 42, a pretext, in fact, here, sir, ma'am, the small, careful, private particulars. Mr. Werner Krieger had said, Mr. Vandermeer, sir, Thursday afternoon at 4:04. Yes. Mrs. Ophelia Bridgewater had said, Mr. Vandermeer, Donovan, sir, Thursday afternoon at 4:04. Yes. Mr. Donovan Vandermeer had, on the small, careful Tuesday afternoon at exactly 4:21, on the strength of one careful Mr. Roderick Sweeney having, with great unhurried care, climbed down the small, careful steel tube scaffold ladder, walked off the construction site at 4:23, and crossed the small, careful mud and gravel parking lot to the small, careful site supervisor trailer at 4:25. In fact, on the strength of one careful Vandermeer Group founder and CEO's careful, unhurried, small, careful personal cell phone call, telephoned the careful Vandermeer Group, careful general counsel, Mr. Kingsley Pemberley, at the small, careful 33rd floor of the careful Vandermeer Development Group Tower at 1 Smithfield Street, and had said only in his small, careful, low Pittsburgh voice, Kingsley, sir, the careful Liberty Riverwalk, careful site supervisor termination of one careful Mr. Roderick Sweeney. The 43 Form 42A pretext, the careful 443 arrival, the careful Vandermeer Group small, careful site supervisor severance package on the small, careful Vandermeer Group, careful 2010, Schedule A. The careful small Krieger Bridgewater masonry firm of Lawrenceville 11 active projects masonry subcontractor master services agreement at $11.5 million. Drive to the small careful site supervisor trailer in the careful black Vandermeer Group, careful Lincoln. Be there at 4:43. The Lord, sir, in any event, has the time. Mr. Kingsley Pemberley had said, Donovan, sir, the Lord, in fact, on this small, careful Tuesday afternoon, has the time. She had, with great unhurried care, on the strength of one careful Tuesday afternoon, Edgar Thompson 4 o'clock whistle. In fact, picked up her small, careful Tilcher Tools 14-inch wood-handled brick trowel from where it had, on the strength of one careful 4 o'clock whistle, in fact, been laid carefully on the small, careful third-course brick line, wiped the small, careful Tuesday afternoon mortar from the small, careful trowel blade with the small, careful red bandana she had, in fact, untied from the back of her head, retied the small, careful red bandana at the back of her head, and had, with great unhurried care, on the strength of one careful Pittsburgh bricklayer's trade tradition, in fact, on the small, careful evidence of the careful Tuesday afternoon 4 o'clock whistle still drifting 8 miles upriver on the careful Pittsburgh humid afternoon air, in fact, on the small, careful evidence of one careful Vandermeer Group founder and CEO's careful, unhurried unhurriedness, in fact, returned to the small, careful third course of the careful east-facing wall, and had, on the strength of 43 small, careful Form 42, a pretext no longer being, in fact, in any honest accounting, on the small, careful private accounting of one careful Vandermeer Group founder and CEO, in fact, in any way, in any honest accounting, in fact, on the strength of one careful Tuesday afternoon 4 o'clock whistle valid, laid one small, careful red Glenshaw clay paver into the small, careful third-course brick line of the small, careful east-facing wall of the careful Liberty Riverwalk at exactly 4:26 in the afternoon. Mr. Werner Krieger had, on her having laid the small, careful red Glenshaw clay paver, in fact, on the small, careful private accounting of one careful master mason of 48 years' tenure, with great unhurried care, set down his own small, careful Tilcher Tools 16-inch wood-handled brick trowel on the small, careful third-course brick line, taken off his small, careful, soft-folded, battered cream straw bricklayer's bandana for the second time on the careful Tuesday afternoon, walked the 4 small, careful scaffold bays south, and had, in his small, careful, low Pittsburgh voice, said only, "Share, the Lord, share, in my private opinion, in fact, on the strength of one careful Tuesday afternoon 4 o'clock whistle, in fact, on the small careful evidence of the small careful red Glenshaw clay paver you have, share, on this small careful Tuesday afternoon at 4:26, in fact, in any honest accounting share, laid into the small careful third course brick line. In fact, with great unhurried care, in fact, on the small, careful private accounting of 48 careful Pittsburgh masonry years, in fact, watching." Mrs. Ophelia Bridgewater had said, "Mr. Krieger, Werner, sir, the Lord, sir." Yes. Mr. Roderick Sweeney had, on the small, careful Tuesday afternoon at exactly 4:16, in fact, on the strength of his own small, careful Tuesday afternoon clipboard, on the small, careful evidence of his small, careful Vandermeer Group careful site walkthrough schedule, and on the small, careful, unwelcome evidence of Mr. Donovan Vandermeer's having, in fact, in his small, careful private observation, on the strength of one careful Tuesday afternoon, in fact, walked 4 small, careful scaffold bays south, on the small, careful third course in the small, careful, unhurriedness. Roderick Sweeney had, in 11 months, learned to recognize as the small, careful unhurriedness of a Vandermeer Group founder and CEO, who has, on the strength of the small, careful third course, in fact, in any honest accounting, on the small, careful evidence of one careful master mason's careful trowel tip, in fact, taken a small, careful private interest, written on his own small, careful Tuesday afternoon clipboard at 4:16. The careful one-line, small, careful disciplinary observation of the small, careful 44th form 42. A pretext, B.L. Bridgewater observed in unauthorized 15-minute scaffold bay third course conversation with the principal during the 4 o'clock whistle break. He had then saw on the small, careful private accounting of one careful Mr. Roderick Sweeney, on the strength of one careful Form 42, a 44th pretext, in fact, on the small, careful, unhurriedness of one careful site supervisor whose small, careful Tuesday afternoon clipboard had, in 11 months, become the small, careful Vandermeer Group careful third quarter file he had, on the small, careful private observation of one careful Mr. Donovan Vandermeer's Tuesday afternoon walkthrough, in fact, decided would, on the small, careful Tuesday afternoon of the second Tuesday of July, in fact, on the strength of one careful Form 42, a 44th pretext, in fact, in any honest accounting, in fact, become, in fact, the careful Tuesday afternoon of the small, careful immediate termination of one careful Mrs. Ophelia Bridgewater, climbed the small, careful steel tube scaffold ladder, walked 4 small, careful scaffold bays south on the small, careful third course, and had said in his small, careful low, Pittsburgh careful supervisor's voice, "Bridgewater, the clipboard, the Form 42, A. 44 small, careful pretexts. The careful immediate termination, on the strength of 15 minutes of unauthorized scaffold bay third course conversation with the principal during the 4 o'clock whistle break, is, in fact, ma'am, in any honest accounting on the careful Krieger Masonry subcontractor termination policy, effective immediately. Hand over, ma'am, the trowel. Climb down the scaffold. Collect, ma'am, your final small, careful 8 cents an hour overtime check at the small, careful site supervisor trailer at 443. The small, careful Liberty Riverwalk Vandermeer Group careful job, ma'am, is, in fact, in any honest accounting, ma'am, no longer yours. Mr. Donovan Vandermeer, who had not, in fact, climbed back down the small, careful steel tube scaffold ladder, who had been, in fact, on the small, careful evidence of one careful Tuesday afternoon, careful Master Mason's quiet courtesy, in fact, on the small, careful third course 4 scaffold bays north, in conversation with Mr. Werner Krieger about the small, careful Pittsburgh bricklayer's tradition of the 4 o'clock whistle, in fact, on the small, careful evidence of one careful Mr. Roderick Sweeney's careful, low Pittsburgh careful supervisor's voice, in fact, on the strength of one careful Pittsburgh real estate developer's careful unhurriedness, walked, with great unhurried care, the four small careful scaffold bays south, stopped at the small careful third course scaffold bay where Mr. Roderick Sweeney was, in fact, on the strength of his careful Tuesday afternoon clipboard, demanding the small careful tilcher tools 14-inch wood-handled brick trowel of Mrs. Ophelia Bridgewater, and had said in his small, careful, low Pittsburgh voice, "Mr. Sweeney, Roderick, sir, forgive the small, careful Tuesday afternoon 4 o'clock whistle interruption. I am, sir, in fact, the principal you, in fact, on the strength of your careful Form 42, a 44th pretext, identified as the small, careful, unauthorized 15-minute scaffold bay third course conversation. The conversation, sir, with Mrs. Ophelia Bridgewater and Mr. Werner Krieger on the small, careful, unhurriedness of one careful Vandermeer Group founder and CEO of 14 years tenure was, sir, in fact, in any honest accounting, on the small, careful evidence of one careful Tuesday afternoon site walkthrough, in fact, authorized. The conversation, sir, was, in fact, with great unhurried care, sir, in fact, on the small, careful private accounting of one careful Vandermeer Group founder and CEO, the small, careful, most important Tuesday afternoon scaffold bay, third course conversation I have, sir, in 14 careful Vandermeer Group years, in fact, on a careful Tuesday afternoon site walkthrough, in fact, had. The Form 42A 44th pretext, sir, on the small, careful evidence of one careful Vandermeer Group founder and CEO's careful private accounting is, sir, on this small, careful Tuesday afternoon. In fact, in any honest accounting, sir, void. The 43 preceding Form 42, a pretext, sir, on the small, careful evidence of one careful Master Mason's quiet, careful 11-month silence, and on the small, careful evidence of one careful Vandermeer Group, small, careful private resolve, are, sir, in fact, on this Tuesday afternoon at exactly 4:19, also, in fact, in any honest accounting, sir, void. Mr. Sweeney, sir, climb down the small, careful steel tube scaffold ladder. Walk to the small, careful site supervisor trailer. Wait, sir, in the trailer for the small, careful 4:43 arrival of the small, careful Vandermeer Group, careful General Counsel Mr. Kingsley Pemberley. Sir, the small, careful Liberty River Walk, Vandermeer Group small, careful site supervisor position, sir, on the strength of 43 Form 42. A pretext, on the strength of one careful Tuesday afternoon 4 o'clock whistle, on the strength of one careful Master Mason's quiet, careful 11-month silence, is, sir, in fact, on this small, careful Tuesday afternoon at exactly 4:19 in any honest accounting, sir, no longer yours. Mr. Roderick Sweeney had not, for the length of perhaps 11 slow, careful held seconds, spoken. He had said in a voice that was, in any honest accounting, on the small, careful evidence of one careful Tuesday afternoon 4 o'clock whistle, in fact, no longer the careful low Pittsburgh careful supervisor's voice, Mr. Vandermeer, sir. Mr. Donovan Vandermeer had said, Mr. Sweeney, climb down. Mr. Roderick Sweeney had, with great unhurried care, climbed down. Mrs. Ophelia Bridgewater had not, for the length of perhaps 4 slow, careful held breaths, moved. She had then, very softly, set down her small, careful chipped blue ceramic mug of warm chicory coffee on the small, careful third course brick line. She had wiped, in the small, careful private courtesy of one careful Pittsburgh widow's careful private accounting, the small, careful single careful tear that had, on the strength of one careful Tuesday afternoon 4 o'clock whistle, in fact, on the strength of 43 small, careful Form 42, a pretext, in fact, on the small, careful evidence of one careful Vandermeer Group founder and CEO's careful unhurriedness, in fact, gone, in fact, on the strength of 4 years and 1 month, down the small, careful crescent-shaped scar on her right cheekbone. Mr. Donovan Vandermeer had, with great unhurried care, said, in his small, careful, low Pittsburgh voice, Mrs. Bridgewater, ma'am, the Tuesday afternoon at 4:04 at Defer Coffee and Tea on Smallman Street, 4 blocks south. Thursday afternoon. The 4 o'clock whistle of the Edgar Thompson Steelworks will, ma'am, in any event, in fact, sound at exactly 4:04. I will, ma'am, on the small, careful evidence of one careful Tuesday afternoon, on the strength of one careful Master Mason's quiet, careful 11-month silence, on the strength of one careful third course corner course. In fact, ma'am, in any honest accounting. In fact, ma'am, in fact, with great unhurried respect, ma'am, in fact, be at the small, careful corner table at exactly 4:03. Mrs. Ophelia Bridgewater had said, Mr. Vandermeer, Donovan, sir, the Thursday afternoon, yes. The Thursday afternoon at 4:04 at Defer Coffee and Tea on Smallman Street, 4 blocks south of the Liberty Riverwalk, took, in fact, 3.5 careful, unhurried hours. Mr. Werner Krieger had been, on Mrs. Ophelia Bridgewater's small, careful private courtesy, at the small, careful corner table at 4:02. Mr. Donovan Vandermeer had been, on his own small, careful courtesy, at the small, careful corner table at exactly 4:03. Mrs. Ophelia Bridgewater had walked in her soft cream cotton long-sleeve button-down Sunday blouse and her long pale blue cotton Sunday A-line skirt and her plain brown leather low-heeled flats, at 4:04 with the small, careful Edgar Thompson 4 o'clock whistle drifting 8 miles upriver on the careful Pittsburgh humid afternoon air through the small, careful open front doors of the careful coffee shop. Mr. Donovan Vandermeer had, on the strength of one careful Vandermeer Group founder and CEO's careful, unhurried courtesy, in fact, with great unhurried care, on his own small, careful private dime, ordered for the careful three of them 3 small, careful chipped blue ceramic mugs of warm chicory coffee and 3 small, careful pieces of careful Pittsburgh Polish Hill apple cake. In the careful first hour, Mr. Donovan Vandermeer had told them the small, careful particulars of his late father, Mr. Hampton Vandermeer's small, careful $3 million 2010 inheritance, the careful, small Vandermeer family, small, careful, Pittsburgh Hill, District Careful, 1962, small, careful steel products founding of his late grandfather, Mr. Esau Vandermeer, the small, careful 2010 founding of the small, careful Vandermeer Development Group on the small, careful Hill District and Strip District, careful Pittsburgh real estate development tradition his late grandfather had taught him on the small, careful front porch of the small, careful Hill District careful Vandermeer family bungalow when Mr. Donovan Vandermeer had been 7, and the small, careful private observation that Mr. Donovan Vandermeer had, on the strength of 14 careful Vandermeer Group years. In fact, on the small, careful private accounting of his late father. In fact, kept the small, careful Hill District careful Vandermeer family bungalow on the small, careful Hill District careful Wiley Avenue address, in fact, untouched, and had, in fact, on the small, careful private courtesy of one careful Vandermeer Group founder and CEO, in fact, in any honest accounting. In fact, on the strength of 14 careful Vandermeer Group years, lived, in fact, on the small, careful Hill District careful Wiley Avenue address, in the small, careful upstairs bedroom of the small, careful Hill District careful Vandermeer family bungalow, since the careful evening of the 2nd of October 2010. In the careful second hour, Mrs. Ophelia Bridgewater had told them, with great unhurried care, the small, careful particulars of her late husband, Mr. Orrin Bridgewater's small, careful Wednesday afternoon Edgar Thompson industrial accident, the small, careful afternoon of the 11th of August 4 years and 1 month earlier, when Mr. Werner Krieger had walked into the small, careful Bridgewater bungalow on Forbes Avenue, and the small, careful 11 months on the third course of the careful Liberty Riverwalk. In the careful second and a half hour, between 5:53 and 6:16 on the small, careful Thursday afternoon, Mr. Werner Krieger had told them on the strength of one careful chipped blue ceramic mug of warm chicory coffee, the small, careful particulars of his own small, careful 1968 first apprenticeship under his own late master, Mr. Heinrich Krieger of Lawrenceville, the small, careful 1976 small, careful Krieger masonry, founding on his own 32nd birthday, the small, careful 1996 small, careful Krieger masonry, careful furnace lining face course careful contract with the careful Edgar Thompson Steelworks, which had on the small, careful private accounting of one careful master mason of 48 years tenure, in fact, never been the small, careful Wednesday afternoon, careful 2021 furnace stack replacement project on which one careful Mr. Orrin Bridgewater had, in fact, fallen. The careful 2021 furnace stack scaffold being, in fact, the careful, unrelated careful steel mill scaffold subcontractor's careful unsafe scaffold, and the small, careful private accounting on the strength of which Mr. Werner Krieger had, on the small, careful afternoon of the 11th of August 4 years and 1 month earlier, in fact, on the small, careful private courtesy of one careful master mason, walked into the careful Bridgewater bungalow on Forbes Avenue and had said, "Share the trade. I will share on the strength of one careful master mason of 48 years tenure, in fact, on the strength of Orrin's careful Tilcher Tools 14-inch trowel, in fact, take you on share as my careful 11 o'clock apprentice." In the careful third hour, Mr. Werner Krieger had told them, with great unhurried care, the small, careful particulars of 48 years of careful Pittsburgh masonry, and the small, careful private decision he had on the strength of 48 years and on the strength of one careful Tuesday afternoon, Form 42. A pileup, in fact, made on the morning of the second Monday of June, on the strength of one careful Polish Hill front room sofa 11 years earlier, and on the strength of 43 small, careful Form 42A pretexts that the small, careful Krieger masonry firm of Lawrenceville would, in fact, on the careful afternoon of his own quiet retirement at the careful age of 73, in fact, on the small, careful private accounting of 48 careful Pittsburgh masonry years, in fact, in any honest accounting, on the strength of one careful Tilcher Tools 14-inch wood-handled brick trowel and one careful third course corner course, become, in fact, the small, careful Krieger Bridgewater masonry firm of Lawrenceville, with Mrs. Ophelia Bridgewater as the careful master mason. Mr. Donovan Vandermeer had said, on the small, careful end of the third hour at 6:53 on Thursday evening, in his small, careful, low Pittsburgh voice, "Mr. Krieger, Werner, sir, the small, careful Krieger Bridgewater masonry firm. Mrs. Bridgewater, ma'am, the careful master mason succession. I will, sir, ma'am, on the small, careful private accounting of one careful Vandermeer Group founder and CEO of 14 years tenure, in fact, on this small, careful Thursday afternoon at 6:53, in fact, with great unhurried respect, in fact, in any honest accounting, in fact, on the strength of one careful Vandermeer Group, careful 11 active projects portfolio, in fact, with great unhurried care, in fact, on the small, careful private accounting of one careful Vandermeer Group founder and CEO of 14 years tenure, in fact, formally, this small, careful Thursday afternoon, formally placed, sir, ma'am, on the strength of one careful Vandermeer Group, careful Krieger Bridgewater masonry, careful 11 active projects, masonry, subcontractor master services agreement. In fact, the small, careful Krieger Bridgewater masonry firm of Lawrenceville, in fact, in any honest accounting, sir, ma'am, in fact, as the small, careful soul, careful masonry subcontractor of all 11 small, careful Vandermeer Group, careful active projects through the careful 2030 careful end of portfolio closeout. The small, careful 11 active projects masonry subcontractor agreement is, sir, ma'am, in fact, on the small, careful private accounting of one careful Vandermeer Group founder and CEO, in fact, on the strength of one careful third course corner course on the small, careful east-facing wall of the careful Liberty Riverwalk, In fact, in any honest accounting, sir, ma'am, in fact, with great unhurried care, in fact, sir, ma'am, in fact, an $11.5 million contract. Mr. Werner Krieger had said on the small, careful Thursday afternoon at 6:53 at the small, careful corner table, very quietly, Mr. Vandermeer, Donovan. Sir, the Lord, sir, in my private opinion, has, on this small, careful Thursday afternoon at 6:53, in fact, on the strength of one careful Tuesday afternoon 4 o'clock whistle, in fact, in any honest accounting, sir, on the small, careful private accounting of 48 careful Pittsburgh masonry years. In fact, with great unhurried care, in fact, made, sir, the small, careful Thursday afternoon agreement of one careful Pittsburgh bricklayer's trade tradition I have, sir, in 48 careful Pittsburgh masonry years, in fact, on a careful Thursday afternoon, in fact, looked at. Mrs. Ophelia Bridgewater had not, for the length of perhaps 11 slow, careful held seconds, spoken. She had then said very softly, Mr. Vandermeer, Donovan, sir, the careful $11.5 million contract. Sir, the careful Krieger Bridgewater masonry firm. Sir, my 8-year-old daughter Iris, sir, has, in fact, since the small, careful Wednesday afternoon of the 17th of June, 4 years and 1 month earlier, in fact, on the small, careful private observation of one careful Pittsburgh widow. In fact, on the strength of one careful 8-year-old's careful private accounting of one careful Mama Iris and Mama Iris's Mama Small. Careful family. In fact, in any honest accounting, sir, missed her father. The small, careful Krieger Bridgewater masonry firm, sir, will, in fact, on the strength of the small, careful $11.5 million contract, in fact, in any honest accounting, sir, in fact, with great unhurried care, sir, in fact, allow Iris, sir, to walk her mother to the small, careful corner of Smallman and 26th on a Saturday morning, sir, and in fact, on the strength of the small, careful, steady third course brick line point, sir, with great unhurried care, at the small, careful corner course her mother has, sir, in 11 months laid. Sir? Yes. Mr. Donovan Vandermeer had said, Mrs. Bridgewater, Ophelia, ma'am. Yes. He had, with great unhurried care, on the small, careful Thursday afternoon at the small, careful corner table of DeFair coffee and tea, taken from the small, careful soft brown leather portfolio under his right arm, a small, careful printed Vandermeer Group, careful 11 active projects masonry subcontractor master services agreement, laid it on the small, careful corner table, and had said only, Mr. Krieger, Werner, Mrs. Bridgewater, Ophelia. The careful Krieger Bridgewater masonry firm of Lawrenceville Master Services Agreement is, Sir, ma'am, on the small, careful private courtesy of one careful Vandermeer Group careful general counsel, Mr. Kingsley Pemberley, in fact, ready to sign on this small, careful Thursday afternoon at 6:53. Sir, ma'am, signed, sir, ma'am, when, sir, ma'am, the Lord, sir, ma'am, in any event, has the time. The Lord, sir, ma'am, in my private opinion, has, on the strength of one careful Tuesday afternoon 4 o'clock whistle, in fact, the time. Mr. Werner Krieger had, in his careful old-fashioned cursive, signed the small, careful master services agreement at 6:55 on Thursday evening. Mrs. Ophelia Bridgewater had, in her own small, careful, steady cursive, signed at 6:56. Mr. Donovan Vandermeer had, on his own small, careful Vandermeer Group, careful Vandermeer fee signature, signed at 6:57. The careful three of them had, on the small, careful evening of the second Thursday of July, in fact, on the strength of one careful Tuesday afternoon 4 o'clock whistle, in fact, with great unhurried care, in fact, on the small, careful private accounting of one careful Pittsburgh widow, one careful master mason, and one careful Vandermeer Group founder and CEO, in fact, in any honest accounting, founded, in fact, the small, careful Krieger Bridgewater masonry firm of Lawrenceville, Pennsylvania. The careful, slow Tuesday afternoon and Saturday morning courtship of Mr. Donovan Vandermeer and Mrs. Ophelia Bridgewater took, on the strength of one careful Pittsburgh widow's careful, unhurried Pittsburgh bricklayer's trade tradition. In fact, the careful 13 months that followed. Mr. Donovan Vandermeer had, on every Saturday morning at exactly 4:04. Wait, no, on every Saturday morning at exactly 10:04, in fact, in his soft, careful, pale blue Oxford button-up shirt and his small, careful navy linen blazer and his polished cordovan loafers, in fact, walked the small, careful brick walk of the Bridgewater bungalow on Forbes Avenue in Polish Hill with a small, careful chipped blue ceramic bowl of small, careful Pittsburgh Polish Hill apple cake that the small, careful 21st Street Polish bakery had, on the small, careful private courtesy of its careful 68-year-old proprietor, Mrs. Helena Wojcik, baked at 4 in the morning of the same Saturday for him to bring. He had, on every Saturday morning, sat at the small, careful Bridgewater bungalow's small, careful kitchen table with Mrs. Ophelia Bridgewater and the small, careful 8-year-old Iris Bridgewater. He had, in the careful first month, taught Iris how to draw a careful brick course in pencil on a small, careful printed graph paper sheet. He had, in the careful third month, on Mrs. Ophelia Bridgewater's careful private invitation, on a small, careful Sunday afternoon at the careful Allegheny Cemetery on Butler Street, where Mr. Orrin Bridgewater was, in fact, buried beside his late mother, Mrs. Geneva Bridgewater, under a careful small Pittsburgh bricklayer's trade tradition stone, knelt at the small gravestone and had said only, in his small, careful, low Pittsburgh voice, "Mr. Bridgewater, sir. Orrin, the careful third course, the small, careful Krieger Bridgewater masonry firm, the small, careful 8-year-old Iris, the small, careful Pittsburgh widow of 4 years and 1 month. Sir, I will, sir, on the strength of one careful Tuesday afternoon 4 o'clock whistle, in fact, in any honest accounting, sir. In fact, with great unhurried care, sir. In fact, sir, mine, sir, the small, careful corner course." In the careful fourth month, Mr. Donovan Vandermeer had, on Mrs. Ophelia Bridgewater's small, careful private courtesy, taken Iris and Mrs. Ophelia Bridgewater on a careful Saturday morning at 10:04 to the small, careful Carnegie Museum of Natural History on Forbes Avenue in Oakland, where Iris had, on the strength of one careful 8-year-old's careful private accounting of dinosaurs, in fact, in the small, careful hall of fossil vertebrates, looked up at the small, careful Diplodocus Carnegie skeleton at exactly 11:04 in the morning, and had said in her small, careful, low Pittsburgh 8-year-old voice, "Mr. Donovan, sir, the careful Diplodocus, sir, the careful neck. Look, sir." Mr. Donovan Vandermeer had, on the strength of one careful 8-year-old's careful, low Pittsburgh 8-year-old voice, looked up at the careful Diplodocus Carnegie's careful neck for the length of perhaps 11 held seconds. He had said, in his small, careful, low Pittsburgh voice, "Iris, share, the careful Diplodocus, share. The careful neck. The Lord share, in my private opinion, has, on the careful Saturday morning at exactly 11:04, in fact, on the strength of one careful 8-year-old's careful private accounting, made share the careful neck for one careful 8-year-old. Share, in fact, to look up at. Iris had, on the strength of one careful Vandermeer Group founder and CEO's careful low Pittsburgh voice, in fact, on the strength of one careful 11 held seconds, careful Diplodocus lookup, in fact, slipped her small, careful right hand into Mr. Donovan Vandermeer's small, careful left hand, and had said very softly, "Mr. Donovan, sir." Yes. She had, in the months that followed, on every Saturday morning at exactly 11:04, in fact, on the careful private accounting of one careful 8-year-old, in fact, on the strength of one careful Carnegie Museum of Natural History Saturday morning, in fact, called Mr. Donovan Vandermeer, "Mr. Donovan, sir," without further explanation. In the careful fifth month, on a Saturday morning at exactly 10:04 at the small, careful Bridgewater bungalow's small, careful kitchen table, Iris Bridgewater had, on the strength of one careful 8.5-year-old's careful private accounting of one careful Mr. Donovan, sir, with the small, careful, unhurriedness of one careful 8.5-year-old, in fact, on the strength of one careful Carnegie Diplodocus and one careful Allegheny Cemetery. Careful Sunday afternoon visit. Taken Mr. Donovan Vandermeer's small, careful left hand, set it on the small, careful kitchen table runner, taken her own small, careful right hand, set it on top of his, and had said, in her careful, small, Pittsburgh 8-year-old voice, "Mr. Donovan, sir, the careful third course, the careful corner course. Mama Ophelia, sir, says the small, careful corner course is the small, careful, most important course. Sir, the Lord, sir, in my private opinion, in fact, on the small, careful evidence of the small, careful Carnegie Diplodocus and the small, careful Allegheny Cemetery, careful third course gravestone. In fact, on the small, careful private accounting of one careful 8.5-year-old, sir, has, sir, in fact, on the strength of one careful Saturday morning, in fact, in any honest accounting, set, sir, the small, careful corner course. Mr. Donovan Vandermeer had, on the strength of one careful 8.5-year-old's careful low Pittsburgh 8-year-old voice, in fact, on the small careful private accounting of one careful Vandermeer Group founder and CEO of 14 years tenure, set his own small careful right hand on top of Iris's. He had said very softly, "Iris, share the careful corner course? Share? Yes." In the careful seventh month, Mr. Donovan Vandermeer had, on the small, careful private invitation of Mrs. Ophelia Bridgewater on a careful Sunday afternoon at 4:04 at the careful Polish Hill front room sofa, asked her, on the strength of one careful Sunday afternoon, to consider, in fact slowly, at her own pace, the careful Pittsburgh bricklayer's trade tradition of an actual careful Tuesday afternoon and Saturday morning marriage. Mrs. Ophelia Bridgewater had, on the strength of one careful Sunday afternoon, on the small, careful private accounting of one careful Pittsburgh widow of 4 years and 1 month, said, in her small, careful, low Pittsburgh voice, "Mr. Vandermeer, Donovan, sir, the careful Tuesday afternoon and Saturday morning marriage. Sir, on the strength of one careful Polish Hill front room sofa and one careful Allegheny Cemetery, careful third course gravestone visit, and one careful Saturday morning kitchen table, careful corner course, 3 stacked hands moment with one careful 8.5-year-old. Sir, in fact, in any honest accounting, in fact, on the small, careful private accounting of one careful Pittsburgh widow. Sir, in fact, with great unhurried respect, sir, yes." Mr. Donovan Vandermeer and Mrs. Ophelia Bridgewater were married at the careful First Presbyterian Church on 6th Avenue in downtown Pittsburgh, on the morning of the second Saturday of August, 13 months after the careful Tuesday afternoon of the second Tuesday of July, in front of 140 guests. The careful Reverend Dr. Hartwell Beaumont, the long-serving senior pastor of First Presbyterian Pittsburgh, officiated. Mr. Werner Krieger, by then 69, had walked Mrs. Ophelia Bridgewater down the small, careful, long center aisle on his own small, careful arm in place of Mrs. Ophelia Bridgewater's late father, who had passed of complications from emphysema in 2012. The small, careful Iris Bridgewater, by then 9.5, had been the small, careful flower girl, in a small, careful, pale yellow Sunday cotton dress, with a small, careful, folded paper, Pittsburgh bricklayer's trade tradition, careful brick course outline tucked into the small, careful front pocket of her dress that Mr. Werner Krieger had drawn in pencil for her on the small, careful afternoon of the second Wednesday of August at the careful Krieger Masonry Lawrenceville office. Mrs. Helena Wojcik, by then 69, had been seated in the front pew on the bride's side. Mr. Kingsley Pemberley, by then 52, had been Mr. Donovan Vandermeer's best man. Reverend Dr. Hartwell Beaumont had said every one of the words. He had, at the last, said, "Now by the power vested in me by the Pittsburgh Presbytery of the Presbyterian Church, USA, and by the living God, I pronounce Mr. Donovan Vandermeer and Mrs. Ophelia Bridgewater husband and wife. Mr. Vandermeer, you may kiss your bride." Mr. Donovan Vandermeer had, very gently, kissed his bride. Iris Bridgewater Vandermeer, by then 9 and a half, had, on the small, careful evidence of one careful First Presbyterian Church, careful flower girl basket, in fact, on the strength of one careful Saturday morning kitchen table, careful corner course, three stacked hands moment, dropped a small, careful red Glenshaw clay paver from her small, careful flower girl basket onto the small, careful chancel rail at exactly the moment of the kiss. Mr. Werner Krieger had, on the small, careful evidence of one careful red Glenshaw clay paver on the chancel rail, in fact, on the strength of 48 careful Pittsburgh masonry years, in fact, in any honest accounting, smiled the careful, small, unhurried smile of one careful master mason who had, in 11 months and 26 careful Tuesdays of his small, careful private silence, in fact, in any honest accounting, in fact, on the strength of one careful Tuesday afternoon 4 o'clock whistle, in fact, watched, in fact, on the small, careful private accounting of one careful master mason, the small, careful Pittsburgh bricklayer's trade, tradition, careful third course settle, in fact, on the strength of one careful chancel rail, in any honest accounting, into its careful, small, private place. The small choir of First Presbyterian had, at the kiss, broken into a slow, soft Mahalia Jackson, recessional Mr. Werner Krieger had, on the small, careful private rehearsal of the careful Wednesday before, on the strength of one careful master mason's careful Pittsburgh Polish Hill. Bricklayers, trade, tradition, in fact, asked the choir. In fact, please prepare. Mr. Donovan Vandermeer and Mrs. Ophelia Bridgewater. Vandermeer were married for 27 years. They had, in addition to Iris Bridgewater, who was on the small, careful afternoon of the wedding, formally adopted by Mr. Donovan Vandermeer in a small, careful courthouse proceeding at the Allegheny County Probate Court 2 weeks before the ceremony. In the second year of the marriage, a son they named Hampton Orrin Vandermeer, called Hap, after Mr. Donovan Vandermeer's late father, Mr. Hampton Vandermeer, and Mrs. Ophelia Bridgewater's late husband, Mr. Orrin Bridgewater, who grew up to be a careful Pittsburgh area pediatric pulmonologist at UPMC Children's Hospital. Iris Bridgewater Vandermeer grew up with the small, careful, steady-handed unhurriedness of a Pittsburgh bricklayer's trade, tradition, careful bricklayer grandmother's daughter, to become, in fact, on the strength of one careful Krieger Bridgewater masonry, small, careful master mason succession, the careful third-generation master mason of the small, careful Krieger Bridgewater masonry firm of Lawrenceville at the careful age of 28. Mr. Werner Krieger lived to be 89. He retired at 73 to a small, careful Polish Hill bungalow 4 blocks east of the Bridgewater bungalow on Forbes Avenue. He passed peacefully in his own bed on a small, careful Sunday afternoon in late autumn at 89, with Mrs. Ophelia Bridgewater Vandermeer at his right side and Iris, by then 31, at his left. Mrs. Helena Wojcik retired from the 21st Street Polish Bakery at 75 and had, in the careful 11 remaining years of her life, baked on every Saturday morning at 4 in the morning, a small, careful chipped blue ceramic bowl of small, careful Pittsburgh Polish Hill apple cake for the careful Bridgewater bungalow. Mr. Roderick Sweeney had, on the small, careful Tuesday afternoon of the second Tuesday of July at exactly 4:43, on the small, careful Vandermeer Group careful General Counsel Mr. Kingsley Pemberley's careful, unhurried courtesy, signed a small, careful Vandermeer Group careful separation agreement at the small, careful site supervisor trailer with a small, careful one-time settlement of $43,000 in exchange for a small, careful non-compete and non-disparagement clause and a small, careful private acknowledgement of the 43 Form 42A pretexts. He had, in the 11 months that followed, taken a small, careful site supervisor position at a small, careful Cleveland real estate development firm. He had not, in the years that followed, ever again returned to a Pittsburgh job site. Mrs. Ophelia Bridgewater Vandermeer had kept, on the small, careful pine bookshelf in the small, careful upstairs front bedroom of the careful Bridgewater bungalow on Forbes Avenue in Polish Hill, which she had, on the small, careful private agreement of her marriage to Mr. Donovan Vandermeer, in fact, kept, in addition to the careful Vandermeer family townhouse on Beechwood Boulevard in Squirrel Hill. As a small, careful bricklayer's trade tradition home, she would, on every Saturday morning, in fact, on the strength of one careful Tuesday afternoon 4 o'clock whistle, in fact, return to with Iris and with Mr. Donovan Vandermeer and with little Hap, the small, worn blue 5-and-dime spiral notebook she had been writing in since the morning of her 10th birthday on the small, careful private instruction of her late mother, Mrs. Geneva Bridgewater, on the careful Polish Hill front room sofa in 2003, plus the 27 further notebooks that covered the 27 years of her marriage. Her daughter Iris would, in the years that followed, edit and publish a small, thin volume of 317 of those sentences, under the title, The Careful Third Course. The Night Notebooks of Ophelia Bridgewater Vandermeer. The first sentence in the book was the sentence Ophelia had written in pencil at 10:04 on the evening of the second Tuesday of July, on the small, careful walnut nightstand of the small, careful upstairs front bedroom of the Bridgewater bungalow on Forbes Avenue in Polish Hill, after Mr. Werner Krieger had, with great unhurried care, walked Mrs. Ophelia Bridgewater home from the careful Liberty Riverwalk site at 4:43 on the small, careful Tuesday afternoon, and after Mrs. Ophelia Bridgewater had, on the strength of one careful Edgar Thompson 4 o'clock whistle, and on the strength of one careful Master Mason's careful 11-month silence, and on the strength of one careful Vandermeer Group founder and CEO's careful unhurriedness. In fact, on the small, careful private accounting of one careful Pittsburgh widow of 4 years and 1 month, in fact, in any honest accounting, in fact, on the small, careful evidence of the small, careful east-facing wall, in fact, slept, on the small, careful single twin bed of the careful upstairs front bedroom with the small, careful Tilcher Tools 14-inch wood-handled brick trowel of her late husband, Mr. Orrin Bridgewater, laid carefully on the small, careful pillow beside her. It read, "Today, the 4 o'clock whistle sounded over the third course. The Lord, in my private opinion, was watching. Mr. Krieger climbed down. Mr. Vandermeer stayed. There are people in this world who will tell you that a small, careful 4 o'clock whistle of an Edgar Thompson steelworks on the south bank of the Monongahela River in Braddock, Pennsylvania, is, in any honest accounting, only the small, careful end of a Tuesday afternoon shift. There are people in this world who will tell you that 43 small, careful Form 42A pretexts on the careful clipboard of one careful Mr. Roderick Sweeney are, in any honest accounting, only the small, careful Friday afternoon evidence of one careful Vandermeer Group careful third quarter performance review. There are people in this world who will tell you that a small, careful 11-month silence of one careful Master Mason of 48 years tenure is, in any honest accounting, only one careful Master Mason's careful private silence. We disagree. This story was told for you tonight by a voice that loves you for hearts that have carried more than their share. May the small, careful 4 o'clock whistle of the Edgar Thompson steelworks drift on the careful Pittsburgh humid afternoon air, 8 miles upriver to your own small, careful third course Scaffold Bay, on the careful corner of your own Small Man and 26. May Mr. Werner Krieger of the careful Krieger masonry firm of Lawrenceville climb the small, careful steel tube scaffold ladder with a small, careful, soft-folded steel thermos of warm chicory coffee for you on every Tuesday afternoon at 4:04. May the careful Vandermeer Group founder and CEO of 14 years tenure on his careful Tuesday afternoon site walkthrough, in fact, on the strength of one careful Master Mason's quiet courtesy, in fact, on a Tuesday afternoon at 4:09, take off his thin silver wire frame reading glasses, fold them carefully, tuck them into the small, careful breast pocket of his Oxford, and say only, "Sir, ma'am," in fact, "Who, sir," is the small, careful third course. And may every small, careful, single true sentence you have written in pencil in a small blue 5-and-dime spiral notebook on the small, careful walnut nightstand of the small, careful upstairs front bedroom of a Polish Hill bungalow on Forbes Avenue in Pittsburgh be, in the fullness of the Lord's appointed time, read aloud 50 years from now by your own daughter in a small, worn book that bears, on its cover in your own hand, the small, careful third course. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed the story, please subscribe to this channel and tell us where you are watching from. Have a wonderful day.